December 7, 1941. As Japanese admirals celebrated their brilliant Pearl Harbor attack, they had no idea they just awakened a silent killer that would strangle their empire from beneath the waves. Over the next 4 years, American submarines would sink 1,178 Japanese ships, crippling 55% of their entire merchant fleet and starving their war machine of oil, food, and supplies. But here's what no one talks about. How did the Japanese Navy, masters of naval warfare, fail so catastrophically to protect the one thing that could have saved them from defeat?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the deck of the battleship Nagato and looked out at the pride of the Japanese Imperial Navy. Giant warships stretched across the harbor like floating steel mountains. Their guns could throw shells the size of small cars across 20 miles of ocean. Yamamoto had spent his whole life building this navy. He had studied at Harvard University in America. He had walked the streets of Washington and seen the factories of Detroit. He knew something that worried him deep in his bones. He knew that Japan was much smaller and weaker than America. But the other admirals did not want to hear this truth. Japan was a chain of islands with almost no oil, no rubber, and not enough food to feed its people. Every drop of fuel for the Navy's great ships came from somewhere else. Tankers brought oil from the Dutch East Indies, crossing thousands of miles of ocean. Freighters carried rice from Korea and Formosa. Ore ships hauled iron and coal from Manchuria. The whole empire ran on ships. Without these merchant vessels moving back and forth like blood through veins, Japan would starve and its war machine would stop. Everyone knew this simple fact. But no one wanted to think about what would happen if those ships started sinking. The Japanese Navy had spent 40 years preparing to fight one kind of war. They dreamed of a great battle where their massive battleships would face the American fleet in one glorious fight. The side with bigger guns and thicker armor would win. They had trained every day for this moment. Their sailors could load and fire their cannons faster than anyone in the world. Their torpedoes ran faster and hit harder than American torpedoes. They had built the largest battleship ever made, the Yamato, with guns so big that each shell weighed as much as a car. This was how real navies fought. This was how wars at sea were won.
Submarines were toys for weak nations. The admirals believed this with all their hearts. Submarines were slow and blind. They could only see a few miles through a periscope. They had to hide and run away from real warships. Only 17 men could fit inside the cramped metal tubes. How could such small, weak vessels ever matter in a real war? The Japanese had submarines too, but they used them only to scout for the main fleet or to attack enemy warships. Using submarines to sink merchant ships seemed cowardly and beneath the honor of a true warrior. It was something that desperate nations might try, but never something that could actually win a war. The Japanese did have some men whose job was to protect the merchant ships. They had a few old destroyers and some small patrol boats. But the Navy gave these ships the oldest equipment and the officers nobody else wanted. Protecting merchant ships was boring work. There was no glory in escorting a slow tanker full of oil. The best officers, the newest ships, and all the resources went to the battle fleet. Convoy escort duty was punishment for officers who had made mistakes. The whole Navy looked down on this work. Japan also had almost no way to find submarines under the water. Their sonar equipment was old and barely worked. Most of their escort ships had no sonar at all. They had no radar that could spot a submarine's periscope cutting through the waves at night. They had depth charges, but these were old designs that often failed to explode. The Japanese had never practiced hunting submarines because they never thought it would matter. Why waste time training for something that would never happen?
On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes struck Pearl Harbor. The attack seemed perfect. They sank or damaged 8 American battleships. They destroyed hundreds of planes on the ground. Across Japan, people celebrated in the streets. The newspapers printed victory headlines in giant letters. The admirals smiled and congratulated each other. They had crippled the American fleet. Now the Americans would have to accept Japanese control of the Pacific Ocean. The war would be over in 6 months, maybe less. But something strange happened in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. American submarines started appearing near Japanese shipping lanes. At first, they only sank 1 or 2 ships. The admirals barely noticed. Merchant ships sometimes sank in storms or hit mines. A few losses meant nothing. Japan had hundreds of merchant ships. They could afford to lose a handful. Then the reports started coming more often. A tanker disappeared off the coast of Formosa. A freighter carrying rice went missing near the Philippines. A transport ship full of troops sent out a distress call and then went silent. The submarines were getting bolder. They were hunting closer to Japan itself. Admiral Yamamoto read these reports with growing worry. He remembered the American factories he had seen. He remembered how Americans thought about war. They would not fight with honor and glory. They would fight with machines and numbers. They would find the weak point and press until something broke. The other admirals were not worried at all. They brushed off the sinking ships like dust from their uniforms. They had battles to plan and battleships to command. They had an empire to defend. Why should they care about a few merchant ships when they had the might of the combined fleet? The submarines would give up once the real fighting started. Everyone knew that submarines could never win a war. It was impossible. It had never happened in all of human history. There was no reason to think it would happen now. By the summer of 1942, the sinkings were no longer occasional reports that could be ignored. They were happening every single day. Japanese merchant captains started sending desperate radio messages before their ships went under. A submarine off the starboard side. Torpedoes in the water. We are hit. We are sinking. Then silence. The Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo kept charts with little pins showing where ships disappeared. Each month, more pins appeared on the map. The pins spread like a disease across every shipping route Japan needed to survive.
What shocked the admirals most was how many submarines the Americans seemed to have. Intelligence reports said the United States had maybe 60 submarines in the Pacific at the start of the war. Japan had thought this number would go down as submarines were sunk or damaged. Instead, the number kept growing. By mid-1942, there seemed to be submarines everywhere at once. One would attack near the Philippines, while another struck off the coast of Japan the same day. A third would sink a tanker near Singapore, while a fourth hunted in the Java Sea. It was impossible. Where were all these submarines coming from? The answer was something the Japanese had never imagined. In places like Groton, Connecticut, and Mare Island, California, American shipyards were building submarines the way car factories built automobiles. They had assembly lines where workers built the same parts over and over until they could do it perfectly with their eyes closed. One submarine would roll out of the yard and another would already be halfway built behind it. The Americans were making submarines faster than Japan could sink them. By the end of 1942, the United States had more submarines in the Pacific than they started with, even after counting the ones that had been lost. Japan had never seen industrial power used this way. Their own shipyards could barely replace the merchant ships they were losing, much less build new warships. The American submarines themselves were also getting better in ways that terrified the Japanese merchant sailors. At first, American torpedoes had been awful. They ran too deep and missed their targets. They hit ships and bounced off without exploding. Submarine captains sent angry reports back to headquarters about the useless weapons. But the Americans did something the Japanese never expected. They admitted the torpedoes were broken, and they fixed them. By late 1942, American torpedoes worked perfectly. Now, when a submarine fired, the torpedo almost always hit and almost always exploded. Ships that might have survived an attack in early 1942 went straight to the bottom in 1943.
The submarines started hunting in groups called wolf packs. 3 or 4 submarines would spread out across a shipping lane and talk to each other using radios. When one submarine spotted a convoy of merchant ships, it would call the others. They would surround the convoy like wolves circling deer. The Japanese escorts would chase one submarine and another would attack from a different direction. Then a third would strike from behind. The convoy would scatter in panic. Ships would sink on all sides. By the time the escorts figured out where all the attacks were coming from, half the convoy would be gone, and the submarines would disappear into the dark ocean. The oil situation became desperate first. Japan's fuel reserves were draining away like water from a cracked jar. The refineries in the Dutch East Indies were pumping out millions of gallons of oil, but it was not reaching Japan. Tankers would leave port full and never arrive. By 1943, the Imperial Navy had to cut fuel rations for training. New pilots got fewer flight hours. Ships stayed in port to save fuel. The giant battleships that were supposed to win the war sat idle because there was not enough oil to move them. Admiral Yamamoto's worst fear was coming true. Japan was being strangled by an enemy they could not see and could not fight.
The rice ships stopped arriving too. Japan could not feed its own people without imports. The warehouses in Tokyo and Osaka started to empty. Rations got smaller. People began to go hungry. The government told everyone to eat less and grow vegetables in their yards, but you cannot grow enough food in a small yard to feed a family. The black market prices for rice went up and up. Workers in the factories got weaker because they were not eating enough. Production slowed down. Everything was connected to those merchant ships at the bottom of the ocean. Some Japanese officers started to understand what was really happening. A few younger captains wrote reports saying that Japan needed to put all its energy into fighting the submarines. They needed better sonar, more escort ships, and officers who were trained to hunt submarines instead of dreaming about battleship duels. These reports went up the chain of command and disappeared. The old admirals did not want to hear that their whole understanding of naval warfare was wrong. They had spent their entire lives preparing for a different kind of war. They could not accept that this ugly, hidden war under the waves was the real war that mattered. So they kept sending the merchant ships out with weak escorts and hoping that somehow things would get better. But things were about to get much worse. The moment of awakening came in the fall of 1943, though by then it was already far too late to change anything. Admiral Koga Mainichi sat in his office looking at a report that made his hands shake. The numbers were so bad he thought there must be a mistake. He called his staff officers in and made them check the math 3 times, but the numbers were correct. In just the last 6 months, American submarines had sunk more than 300 Japanese merchant ships. That was more ships than Japan could build in 2 years. The empire was bleeding to death, and there was no way to stop it. What broke Admiral Koga was not just the numbers, it was what the numbers meant. He finally understood that everything he had believed about naval warfare was wrong. His beautiful battleships with their massive guns meant nothing if there was no fuel to move them. His aircraft carriers were useless without oil for the planes. His destroyers and cruisers could not fight if they were stuck in port trying to save fuel. The submarines had not beaten Japan by winning glorious battles. They had won by making it impossible for Japan to fight at all. It was like watching someone die not from a sword wound, but from slow starvation. There was no honor in it, no moment of heroic defeat, just a slow, grinding collapse that could not be stopped. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Koga ordered a complete review of Japan's convoy protection system. What he discovered made him feel sick. Japan had started the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. That sounds like a huge number. But in 2 years of war, the submarines had already sunk half of it, 3 million tons at the bottom of the ocean. And Japan had only managed to build back about 500,000 tons of new ships. The math was simple and horrible. Japan was losing ships 6 times faster than they could replace them. At this rate, there would be no merchant fleet left by 1945. None at all. The staff officers brought him more reports that showed how bad things really were. The oil refineries in the Dutch East Indies were still working perfectly. They were pumping out more oil than Japan needed. But only 1 out of every 3 tankers that left with oil actually made it to Japan. The other 2 were at the bottom of the ocean. The submarines were sitting right on the shipping routes, like cats waiting at a mouse hole. They did not even have to search anymore. They just waited, and the tankers came to them. Some submarine captains sank so many ships they ran out of torpedoes and had to go home early. Other submarines started using their deck guns to sink small ships because they wanted to save their torpedoes for bigger targets. What made it even worse was that Japan had done this to themselves. They had the intelligence reports. They had known since early 1942 that the Americans were planning to use submarines to attack merchant shipping. But the admirals had ignored those reports because they did not fit with their ideas about how war should be fought. They had 3 years to build escort ships, to train submarine hunters, to develop better sonar and radar. They had done almost nothing. Now it was too late. You cannot build a navy in a few months. It takes years to train officers who know how to fight submarines. Japan did not have years anymore. They probably did not even have months. Admiral Koga read reports from merchant ship captains who survived attacks. Their words showed men who were absolutely terrified. They described how submarines would surface at night right next to a ship and fire torpedoes from so close they could not miss. They told of watching other ships in their convoy break in half and sink in less than 2 minutes. They talked about floating in the ocean for days waiting for rescue that often never came because Japan did not have enough ships to search for survivors. The captains said their crews were breaking down. Men were refusing to sail, some were deserting, others were drinking themselves senseless before each voyage because they were sure they would die. The industrial numbers told an even darker story. The steel mills in Japan were running at half capacity because iron ore ships were not arriving. The aircraft factories were slowing down because they had no aluminum. The munitions plants were cutting production because supply ships carrying raw materials kept sinking. Every part of Japan's war machine was connected to those merchant ships, and the merchant fleet was disappearing. American submarines were not just sinking ships, they were dismantling Japan's ability to make weapons, feed people, and keep fighting. Koga realized something that made him feel hollow inside. Japan had already lost the war. Not in some future battle, not when the Americans invaded. They had lost it in 1943 because they no longer had the resources to fight. The army in China was not getting supplies. The garrisons on the Pacific Islands were starving. The cities at home were running out of food. The submarines had cut Japan off from everything it needed to survive as a modern nation. The empire was like a head that had been cut off from its body, but did not know it was dead yet.
He thought about Admiral Yamamoto, who had died earlier that year when American planes shot down his transport. Yamamoto had warned them. He had told them that Japan could not win a long war against America's industrial power. He had seen the factories and the shipyards. He had known what was coming. But the other admirals had not listened. They had been so sure that their courage and skill would overcome American numbers. Now, Koga understood what Yamamoto had meant. You cannot fight a war without fuel, without food, without ships to carry supplies. All the courage in the world does not matter if your navy cannot leave port and your people are starving. The worst part was knowing there was nothing he could do to fix it.
On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke on the radio for the first time in history. His voice was thin and scratchy through the static. He told the Japanese people that the war was over. Japan had surrendered. Most people could barely understand his formal, ancient way of speaking, but they understood enough. They had lost. Everything they had suffered for, everything they had sacrificed, had been for nothing. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto stood in the ruins of Yokohama and tried to understand what he was seeing. He had been a submarine captain himself, one of Japan's best. He had spent the war hunting American warships while American submarines hunted Japanese merchant ships. Now he was home, and his country looked like it had been hit by an earthquake that never stopped. Entire neighborhoods were just ash and rubble. The famous ports where the great battleships once anchored were filled with sunken ships. The proud Imperial Navy had been reduced to a few rusty hulls that would never sail again. But what struck him most was how thin everyone looked. The people walking through the streets were like skeletons covered in skin. Their eyes were hollow. They moved slowly, without energy, like old people, even when they were young.
Hashimoto had been at sea for most of the war. He had not seen what was happening at home. Now he walked through Tokyo and understood what the American submarines had really done. It was not just about sinking ships. It was about taking away everything Japan needed to be a modern country. The stores were empty. There was almost no food for sale at any price. People were eating grass and tree bark to survive. The factories were silent and cold. There was no coal to run them, no oil to power the machines, no raw materials to make anything. The trains barely ran because there was no fuel. The whole country had been pushed back 100 years to a time before machines and industry. He met with other Navy officers who had survived. They gathered in a building that still had most of its roof and talked about what had gone wrong. The numbers they shared made Hashimoto feel like he was going to be sick. American submarines had sunk 1,178 Japanese ships. Almost 1,200 ships at the bottom of the ocean. That was 5 million tons of shipping. Japan had ended the war with less merchant shipping than a small country like Denmark. The empire that once controlled half of Asia could barely move supplies between its own islands. But the raw numbers did not tell the whole story. An old logistics officer named Tanaka spread out charts that showed what those sinkings actually meant. In 1941, Japan had imported 6 million tons of oil. By 1944, they were importing less than 300,000 tons. That was a 95% drop. The modern Japanese military needed millions of gallons of fuel every month just to operate. By the end of the war, there was not enough fuel to train pilots, move ships, or run trucks. The army in China had been fighting without fuel for trucks and tanks. Soldiers had been moving supplies by hand and by horse cart like in ancient times. Planes sat on airfields unable to fly. The mighty battleship Yamato had been sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa with only enough fuel for a one-way trip because Japan had no fuel to bring it home.
The food situation was even more devastating to understand. Japan had always needed to import food. The islands could not grow enough rice to feed 80 million people. Before the war, ships brought rice from Korea, Formosa, and Southeast Asia. By 1945, those ships were gone. Tanaka showed them documents proving that over 2 million Japanese civilians had died from malnutrition and starvation during the war. Not from bombs, not from fighting. They had simply starved to death because the food ships never arrived. Hashimoto thought about his own children and felt his eyes burn with tears. How many of those 2 million deaths could have been prevented if the Navy had protected the merchant fleet instead of dreaming about battleship duels? An intelligence officer brought in documents that American forces had left behind. These papers showed the American submarine strategy in detail. Hashimoto read them with a growing sense of horror and respect. The Americans had planned everything perfectly. They had identified the exact shipping routes Japan needed to survive. They had calculated how many ships Japan could afford to lose before the economy collapsed. They had positioned their submarines like surgeons choosing where to cut. And they had been right about everything. One American admiral had written in 1942 that if submarines could sink 600,000 tons of shipping per year, Japan would lose the war by 1945. The submarines had sunk more than 1,000,000 tons per year. Japan had actually lost faster than the Americans predicted. What broke Hashimoto's heart was learning how preventable it all was. The Americans shared studies showing that Japan could have fought the submarines effectively if they had started early enough. Germany had lost hundreds of U-boats fighting British convoy escorts in the Atlantic. The British had developed good sonar, trained dedicated submarine hunters, and learned how to protect their merchant ships. Japan could have done the same thing. They had the intelligence, they had the warnings, they had the time. But the admirals had been too proud and too stubborn to believe that submarines could matter. They had spent all their resources on battleships and carriers while the merchant fleet died. Some of the officers argued that Japan never had a chance. America was too big, too rich, too powerful. But Hashimoto did not believe that anymore. Japan had lost because they had made stupid choices based on outdated ideas. They had worshipped honor and glory instead of thinking clearly about how to protect what they needed to survive. They had looked down on the unglamorous work of convoy escort and submarine hunting. They had convinced themselves that courage could overcome industrial power. Every one of those beliefs had been wrong, and millions of people had paid the price.
He walked down to the docks, where he had first gone to sea as a young officer. The water was full of oil and garbage. Sunken ships stuck up from the harbor bottom like the ribs of dead animals. An old merchant sailor sat on a broken pier with a fishing line in the water. Hashimoto sat down next to him. The sailor looked at his uniform and spat into the water. "You Navy men! You told us your big ships would protect us. You said the American Navy was weak. You said we would win in 6 months." The sailor's voice was bitter and tired. "My ship was sunk in 1943. I spent 2 days in the water before someone picked me up. I watched 30 of my friends drown. And you know what makes me so angry? It did not have to happen. If you admirals had spent half as much time protecting merchant ships as you did polishing your battleships, maybe my friends would still be alive. Maybe my country would not be starving." Hashimoto had no answer for him. The sailor was right. Everything he said was true. The Japanese Navy had failed at the most basic mission of any navy, which is to protect your own shipping and destroy the enemy's. They had been so obsessed with fighting like samurai that they forgot wars are won by nations, not by individual warriors. They had learned this lesson the hardest way possible. In the years after the war, Hashimoto wrote a book about his experiences. He included a chapter about what Japan should have learned from the submarine campaign. He wrote that modern war is about logistics, not glory. It is about protecting boring things like tankers and freighters. It is about accepting that the enemy will use whatever works, not what seems honorable. It is about adapting when you are wrong instead of stubbornly sticking to failed ideas. He wrote that Japan's admirals had been educated in a 19th century way of thinking about war, and they could not adjust to 20th century reality. That failure had killed their navy, their empire, and millions of their people.
The legacy of the submarine campaign shaped how Japan rebuilt itself. The new generation of Japanese leaders understood that military power without economic power means nothing. You cannot fight if you cannot feed your people and fuel your machines. You cannot win by being brave if the enemy can simply cut off everything you need to survive. Japan spent the decades after the war building an economy that did not depend on conquest and empire. They learned to trade instead of invade. They learned that real power comes from making things people want to buy, not from having the biggest battleships. The American submarine campaign had been the most successful naval blockade in human history. In 4 years, submarines had done what no surface fleet could have done. They had isolated an island empire and watched it slowly suffocate. The Japanese admirals had never expected it because they had never been willing to see it. They had looked at the world the way they wanted it to be instead of how it actually was. And that blindness had cost them everything. The real lesson was simple but painful. In war, the side that understands reality wins. The side that believes in myths loses. Japan had believed in the myth of the decisive battle and the glory of the warrior. America had believed in numbers, logistics, and doing whatever worked. Reality had sided with America, and there was nothing honor or courage could do to change that cold, hard truth.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.